Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 18 of the Late Stage Podcast, and I'm your host, Sinan Schwarting, coming in live from New York. I'm repping my favorite Knicks, of course, going on a classic Knicksian 4-game winning streak, just when it stops mattering, pretty much, right? Or just when they can't make the playoffs, or just about, mathematically, there's a chance. And we're always hoping for a Broadway miracle or whatever. But back to reality here. Not that sports can't be news, right? Of course, we've talked about sports in the past. Fantastic guest, Matthew Miranda. Shouts to Matthew. Doing good things out there. But so today, there's a lot to talk about. And of course, the war in Ukraine remains front and center for most people. And I will talk a bit about that, specifically about the sort of burgeoning humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis that's coming from this. And there's the sort of unprecedented rate at which it is snowballing, essentially. So that's going to be a bit of my focus, of course. But first, and because I like to focus on what the rest of the media is not focused on as much, this week I'm going to actually focus on Yemen. And I know a lot of people on the left will applaud that. It's been a common criticism that folks in the media have given so much attention to the problem in Ukraine. Where was that focus in light of what's been going on in Yemen or Somalia? And while I've always made a point of talking about all of those things, again, there's not like a major news story coming out of Yemen at the moment necessarily, except I was watching a very interesting news piece, a little interview by Ryan Grimm for The Intercept. And actually, I'm not sure if the interview was for The Intercept in retrospect, but certainly he was interviewing a Yemeni writer who had written a really fascinating piece in The Intercept. And without diverting to that as my topic, it did bring up an interesting point. They mentioned this as the 7-year anniversary of the crisis, the war, the civil war in Yemen. And I thought that was interesting. I thought it was very interesting on a few levels, insofar as, so he said this coming Saturday would be the 7-year anniversary. And so, at the time, it was just this weekend I'd been watching it. So like that Saturday was the 26th. But so I thought, okay, maybe if they took some time to edit it or whatever, he would have been referring to March 19th, the Saturday before last. And that lined up with some events. So it got me thinking, perhaps on the podcast I should basically review, I'm going to take off a layer here, but I thought that I should review the war in Yemen, what it originates from, why folks are at times hyper-focused on it and want more attention on it and all that. And just, to give people a sense of what it's about. On the 7-year anniversary. I apologize for folks who are tuning in via YouTube for any lighting issues. I'm going on natural lighting. It's a beautiful day here in New York. It's actually frigid. I keep saying spring is sprunging, but we're not there yet. Apparently, this roller coaster that is climate change. But so anyway, on the 7-year anniversary of the beginning of the crisis that we now can basically refer to as a humanitarian crisis in Yemen, I personally thought that it's worth noting that hostilities between the Houthis, who are the rebels that are now in control and against Saudi Arabia and being slaughtered indiscriminately. Their dispute with the sort of previous Yemeni government, I think at its heart really starts in 2004. And I don't know how often this is discussed, but the Yemeni government at the time killed Houthi leader Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi in a government crackdown following his protests against government policies that were being implemented at the time. Anytime you kill someone because they're protesting, you're not only going to martyr them, right? But you're not going to be perceived of as a good guy by sane and rational people. Now, granted, this is in 2004. This long precedes what we know of today as the modern dispute between factions or sides. But I think it's an important historical sort of precursor to much of what we know about the conflict. Now, let's go further. Let's go back to the future, to the past. So now the official beginning of the Civil War. And so the reason I thought this was actually kind of noteworthy, not just, I mean, of course, the 7-year anniversary of a terrible humanitarian crisis / civil war. In light of, I mean, we see the horrific tragedies of something just months in the making in Ukraine. Now imagine 7 years. Imagine what those people are going through there. But so the other reason I thought this was of note was because my understanding was that the whole thing had begun in September of 2014. So before what he was referring to in that interview as the beginning of the Civil War. What came up in the conversation, sort of in the build up to it, was that he had said that the 7-year anniversary of the conflict in Yemen was coming up this coming Saturday. And at the time, it was like just after Saturday, the 26th of March. And I thought that doesn't really line up. You know, perhaps March 25th is a fairly significant date in some sense. Although March 21st is when there was a sort of general declaration. But so the previous Saturday was March 19th, or had been, I should say, March 19th. And March 19th, 7 years prior, in 2015, is certainly a significant event. So it got me digging into the timeline of how things happened in Yemen and how the conflict had been created and stirred up. And in researching it myself, I thought, this could be fascinating for the listeners of my podcast. I think there's generally a lot of talk of Yemen, certainly by folks on the left who think, with all the attention going to Ukraine, like, what about these other conflicts that, like, the U.S. is involved in? And it's actually somewhat of a fascinating conflict, I guess, insofar as, like, at its face, it's a civil war, right, between two Yemeni sides. But the extent to which it's backed globally, especially one side, is, it's almost at a scale that's World War-esque. But so we'll talk about that as well. But first, in line with talking about just the history of how the conflict got going, I thought I would run down that for folks who maybe are less aware. And so first of all, you have currently two sides of this conflict. Right? You have the Houthi, which were initially called the armed movement, the Houthi armed movement, and are now in control over the heart of Yemen, certainly the capital, Sana'a, and its surrounding regions. I'll put up a map. And on the flip side, you had the Yemeni government at the time, pre-war, who are still holding on to regions in the east of the country and parts of the south. They're fighting in the name of, in loyalty to the previous leader, Abdrabu Mansur Hadi. who represented the Yemeni government at the time. Their regions of the south are being contested by a third party now as well, the Southern Transitional Council, who are, I suppose, in conflict with both parties somehow. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well later on. There's some intrigue involving regional conflicts and all that. But so anyway, first of all, let's, in line with talking about the history itself. So one of the reasons it was interesting for me that he marked the 7th year anniversary as being around March of 2015 is because, as far as I was aware, it was in the fall of 2014 that the Houthis claimed essentially Sana'a and took power. But so in digging in, right, what actually happens is, once again, it starts out as street-level protests. Houthis have come in to protest cuts to fuel subsidies. Street protests, right? People coming in to debate. I don't know if debate is the word. They might be armed, right? But to fight against a policy decision regarding subsidies, right? Nothing crazy. We've actually seen stuff like this happening all over the world. Also a product of similar economic woes, right, relating to inflation, price of gas, fuel, etc. Apologies for those city sounds. I'm gonna try to fight through it. Yeah, sorry. Just kidding. I couldn't fight through that. It got too loud. So anyway, yeah. So in September of 2014, protests erupt in Sana'a, where the Houthis essentially take power. And it starts against street-level protests and expands to them taking control of the regional government rapidly, as a matter of fact. And street-level battles, certainly some violence, right? But this movement, perhaps with the backing of popular sentiment, you can't imagine it getting too far without it. But yeah, it expands. And so by February 29th of 2015, Hadi has to flee from the capital. So I think by most measures, certainly as far as the Houthis view it, mission accomplished. They've gotten the leader to flee. They've got control of the regional government in the capital. Seems like, a conflict that started in 2014 and that was the kind of end result that I think they had sought. Just as most conflicts, that's the end game, right? Like Putin wants to remove Zelensky, and in this case, they had sought legislative change, and in the end, got the government. And again, going back to the 2004, where that government had murdered their leader, there was probably a sense of justice to this, that they had gained such prominence, politically speaking. But it was what it was. I mean, the only discrepancy, perhaps, for some people in the country is that they're Shia. So there's a sort of Sunni Shia element that ushered in tons of speculation. Perhaps their successes because Iran's involved, Iran being a Shia as well. And this is yet to be proven definitively, in fact. Tons of allegations and tons of money poured in to the region in the name of this being a conflict against Iran, and yet we've still yet to it's like the WMD thing. Given that it's the same region, shouldn't surprise anyone. But so, there it is. Hadi fled on February 29th of 2014, and it looked like that's where this conflict had culminated. As these forces, the Houthis, sort of seek to gain control over the rest of the country, on March 19th, they reached the airport of Aden, which is under sort of pro-Hadi force. Pro-Hadi forces have controlled, essentially. They come in to sort of take control and are beaten back, defeated. And I think it's the first time that there's a recognition by the Houthis that there's going to be an armed pushback from some people, that there's enough support, right? I think perhaps by their metric, there hadn't been enough support for Hadi to really require anything, any formal declarations, right? I think they're still pushing for their policy, essentially, at this point. And I don't know if that means that they're willing to cede control of the government back to normal order or whatever it is, or what. But after losing this decisive battle in the airport of Aden on March 21st, 2015, and I think this might be what we're talking about, the 7-year anniversary of, the Houthis declare a general mobilization to overthrow Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi. So again, it had not been formally recognized that this was like an armed conflict, a civil war, that there was like a side with a goal. And now, with Hadi having fled to Aden, and with them controlling the heart of the country, that's now the goal is to unseat Hadi officially, right? They're not going to work with him to enact policy change. They're going to overthrow him. And so I don't know the scale of violence that had gone into this conflict prior, but apparently whatever it was that occurred on March 19th got pushback from the Houthis to the extent that they decided they were officially starting a civil war. Apologies for lighting, by the way, folks. I'm trying to use natural lighting. So if you're watching on YouTube, if it gets darker, blame the sun and myself, honestly, for not preparing beyond that. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about what came next on the timeline. Basically, the Houthis, in now an officially recognized armed conflict, start expanding their territories immediately. They came for the Lahij Governorate, and it fell by March 25th, 4 days later. And in doing so, they then reached the outskirts of Aden, which is the seat of Hadi's power at this point. So within days, they're knocking at his doorstep. They are wildly successful. I don't know what you can attribute Houthi success to, and I think perhaps that's where the Iran must be helping thing comes from. Perhaps they're well armed regardless. There are a number of other conflicts going on in this region. They've been fighting against Al-Qaeda, ISIS. There's a gamut. Al-Qaeda literally has a territory in Yemen, kind of right in the border on the southeast border between where the Houthis control and where Hadi forces control. And this is what the US had been there drone striking sort of leading into the conflict. And so that's kind of what they're doing there to begin with in a lot of ways. They're fighting Al-Qaeda, who actually control territory. I wasn't aware of the fact that they actually had recognized that they were a functioning state of any sort. I didn't know they were trying to control territories. There's something frightening, perhaps, in that, right? But anyway, immediately, and this is interesting, the Houthi forces start focusing more on fighting against the Al-Qaeda-controlled territory because they're launching devastating attacks into their maybe perhaps with the goal of expanding Al-Qaeda territory and hitting a weakened Houthi, whatever it is, they're not at all friends. And so anyone trying to assume the US is fine helping to bomb the Houthis because perhaps they're in league with Al-Qaeda, not at all. They are very much at conflict, perhaps even more than with the Hadi forces, and we'll get into that later as well. What's important to note, though, is so March 25th, the Houthis expand their territory greatly, and immediately Saudi Arabia gets involved. They launch military operations using airstrikes to restore the former Hadi government. And of course, for them, now you have the Shia Sunni, right? This becomes a sectarian ethnic conflict. And they're losing, of course. I mean, it's a regional ally for Saudi Arabia. I suppose they could make the argument it's more geopolitical, but what would stop them from working with the Houthis in the same way that they were working with whoever was in control of Yemen previously? Right? Apparently, they feel it's in their sphere of interest, right? We see a lot of evil being done in the name of that. And there, immediately, you have the very obvious link to what we're seeing in Ukraine. People sort of being like, how could you claim to be so upset about what you're seeing there when here's what we're seeing in Yemen? And of course, in this case, it's Saudi Arabia that are the ones over involving themselves in someone else's conflict. For Saudi Arabia, there is this regional, like they're fighting Iran. And so for a Shia ethnic minority to control Yemen would probably link them to Iran. Iran has gone on the record, Ali Khamenei came out and said that they offered spiritual support to the Houthis, who, again, I mean, they're both Shia, so you wouldn't be too surprised by that. But there's still to this date no indication of Iranian involvement in whatever is going on with the Houthis. So this, like, we'll fast forward again, 2017. I mentioned earlier the STC, which is the Southern Transitional Council. And what's fascinating here is that a Gulf ally of the United States and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, has fairly direct financial ties to this STC, who are now sometimes clashing with the Saudi-backed pro-Hadi forces. So this is a regional conflict that's starting to blossom into much more by 2017. Now, again, I also mentioned Al-Qaeda has territory in this region as well, and a very small portion of Yemen. The IS, right, the Islamic State, ISIS, is supposedly active in various regions as well. This is just pardon my use of language here, but this is a clusterfuck at this point, right? Al-Qaeda's territory is what's called the hinterlands, which just sounds menacing. I mean, it sounds like something Sam Raimi wrote for a Spider-Man movie. So, where does this take us? Where does this bring us? You can imagine the humanitarian crisis coming out of this, and I'll get into that in a moment. Now, for folks who are likening what Russia's doing to Ukraine to Yemen and are implicating the United States, the question becomes, like, what are the ties that the United States has to this conflict? And that's fairly complex. Now, during Hadi's presidency, and this is even preceding this conflict, mostly even, if you could say preceding this conflict, the United States had been in business with Hadi to drone strike Al-Qaeda territory, right? That territory in the quote unquote, hinterlands where, the Hand and any other bad guy organization probably resides as well, but whatever, the hinterlands, gosh. But anyway, so the ties that the U.S. has to this conflict stem to there, and I think if that were it, you could say, what do you expect, right? Of course, the U.S. is still going after Al-Qaeda if they have territory somewhere, right? Al-Qaeda, who is 100% responsible for 9/11. But In addition, and I suppose if you look at the United States as a government that does things officially on paper as one thing, then you also have another part of the story here, which is that in June of 2019, Raytheon had apparently supplied, so they found a laser-guided bomb that had killed 6 civilians was found to be a Raytheon bomb. And so you can only imagine that they don't just sell them one at a time, right? I'm sure there were more than one Raytheon bombs that helped kill civilians all over the place. Which, of course, naturally begs the question, do you consider that the U.S., right, a corporate entity that's from the United States that's giving weapons to people committing war crime? That starts to gray things a little further, right? It's like, okay, you're fighting Al Qaeda and drone striking people for that. That's one thing. Fine. You're, all right. And drone strikes I've talked about previously are highly questionable in their inefficacy and how easy it is for innocent people to be killed by accident, but with the use of them. But anyway, anyone who still wanted to sort of like, erase the United States' implication, they're being implicated in this conflict, it's totally impossible. In May 2019, Mike Pompeo, under Trump, the peace president, as he likes to claim, pushed through an emergency $8.1 billion of arms sales to Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. This was being done in the name of fighting Iran in the region. And that's 100% right. The conflict that's occurring in the region against quote unquote Iran is the bombing of Yemen and the starving of the people of Yemen and the just crazy humanitarian crisis that is occurring at that point. Importantly, in August of 2018, United States Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said that the U.S. would keep supporting the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen. That under the promise that the Saudis had made to do everything humanly possible to do no damage to innocent lives. The World Food Program in March of 2021 said that more than 400,000 children under the age of 5 could die from acute malnutrition if the Saudi-led blockade continues or the war continues. So, right, the United States will continue backing the Saudi-led campaign in which a promise was made that everything humanly possible would be done to not hurt innocent people. And again, 400,000 children under the age of 5 could die from malnutrition because of the blockade being imposed by Saudi Arabia. Children under the age of 5, again, right? You can't underscore how innocent a child under the age of 5 is. Now, here's where things get even murkier. A CNN-led investigation, and I highlight that because they tend to carry water for the government and not highlight these types of things. It turns out that US-made weapons were falling in the hands of Al-Qaeda-linked fighters. Again, Al-Qaeda has territory in Yemen, and it means that the weapons that were being given to Saudis were somehow making it into the hands of Al-Qaeda. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine how the Houthis could be the enemies of the United States and how the United States could justify supporting war crimes being committed, materially supporting, right? Like we've covered how, right? $8.1 billion in arms sales. They're helping operate drone strikes. The United States has had one troop killed in this conflict. They have to help operate the drones. And let me just back this out, right? So when you look at the two sides, you have the Houthis, and you have the pro-Hadi force, and you have the STC, right? I'm forgetting the name again, right? The Southern Transitional Council. And you have Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has alleged links now, alleged by CNN, and investigated and proven as far as that goes. Whether you want to trust CNN is a whole other thing, but like, again, considering they're implicating the side that they're usually carrying water for, this is one of the rare instances where I think we can almost reflectively trust this might be true. So you have Saudi Arabia and perhaps the United Arab Emirates helping Al-Qaeda. You have the United Arab Emirates helping the Southern Transitional Council, who are fighting against both pro-Hadi forces and Houthis. So all kinds of chaos there. And perhaps the United Arab Emirates helping them. But also United Arab Emirates are officially recognized as allies to pro-Hadi forces. So you have Saudi Arabia, who's lost 10,000 plus men in this conflict. United Arab Emirates have lost around 1.1 thousand men. 1,100 men to this war, men and women, perhaps. Senegal is a committed ally. I don't think they've lost anyone officially. Sudan is a committed ally. They've lost 9.4K men and women, potentially. Qatar, an officially registered ally in this war. They've lost 4 soldiers. Morocco has lost 10 soldiers in support of pro-Hadi forces. Qatar has lost 4 soldiers. Bahrain has lost 9. Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain have all committed less than 1,000 troops to support pro-Hadi forces. So now we've got, as I mentioned, Morocco and Senegal involved, talking about world war scope here, are now materially supporting the pro-Hadi formerly empowered Yemeni government, who, whatever, they're against Al-Qaeda, although their allies in Saudi Arabia might be helping them somehow through arms. Anyway, the United States, the United Kingdom, Israel, NATO, all recognized allies. France, Italy, Spain, Turkey, Somalia, Malaysia, Djibouti, Pakistan, and Mauritania are all formally supporting pro-Hadi forces in this Yemen conflict, civil war. As for the Houthis, allegedly, Iran is supporting them. Again, as I've mentioned previously, nothing has actually formally been linked to them. Allegedly, Hezbollah, North Korea, and Syria are also supporting the Houthi forces somehow, although, again, only very tenuous stuff has been able, that's why we can only put that in the range of alleged, right? Nothing formal by any means. So, quite troubling. Am I saying that I support the Houthis? I don't know a single Houthi, or Yemeni for that matter. I don't know much about the conflict itself. I've perhaps hedged that I can understand why there might be some malevolence towards that Yemeni government in particular, who killed their leader in 2004 and, kind of created a martyr there. Not to say that whatever he'd been martyred over, whatever it was that he'd been fighting for in the first place, was justified or legitimate. Again, right? Like, this is a conflict that's very far away from me. And ideally, like, we wouldn't be happening at all, right? But would be happening at such a scale that it was just contained to two sides fighting for their causes, right, regionally, and it would be done and dusted. And where we were 7 years ago on March 19th, right? Leading into March 19th, it seemed like this was a conflict that was going to be extinguished fairly quickly because of the efficacy of Houthi forces. They're going to stake their claim, maybe gain more power regionally, have a larger place in the government, but there wasn't even a formal declaration to remove Hadi. Abdurabu Mansur Hadi. So there it is. Because of essentially foreign intervention and folks deciding that they could not accept whatever that outcome was, this thing has turned into a 7-year conflict and a gigantic humanitarian crisis. 100,000, again, more than 100,000, this is a very rough estimate, more than 100,000 people killed. More than 12,000 civilians. On top of those 100,000 people, more than 85,000 people have died from famine because of the conflict and because of the blockade by Saudis. The UN has warned that up to 13 million people could face starvation eventually. I already mentioned that among those 13 million, more than 400,000 of them would be children under the age of 5. So as far as the Saudis doing everything humanly possible not to damage innocent lives, that ship has sailed. President Biden, when he came in, right, and from the election process and everything, part of his promise was to remove the United States from this conflict and no longer help Saudi Arabia perpetuate war crimes. Saudi Arabia, the reason I implicate them as perpetuating war crimes, they have enacted widespread bombing of civilian areas. It is officially already on the books, killed or injured more than 19,000 people as of last year. I don't have a more recent figure. So, where does that leave us? Is this an atrocity at the scale of, right? Is the US committing an atrocity at the scale of what Russia is? Certainly not directly. There aren't United States soldiers, mowing down Houthi forces and innocent people, as we're seeing in Ukraine. So it's not a like for like. It's an apples and oranges. But the United States is absolutely helping the people doing that. So maybe they have a Belarus role, if we're going to liken it to the Russia conflict. And nobody's fond of what Belarus is doing. They've already been sanctioned quite thoroughly. And perhaps way more of a role than that's naive to say they have a Belarus role. They've funded, again, $8.1 billion to those 3 nations in the region. You can imagine the bulk of it going to Saudi Arabia. The United States has more than turned a blind eye to war crimes. They have enabled it. So, a 7-year crisis in Yemen. The good news, I suppose, is the silver lining is that enough attention has been brought to this conflict and enough of the war crimes and the atrocities and the stuff that the United States has enabled has been brought to light by a free press and all that, right? That's something that would never happen in Russia, perhaps, is that popular sentiment has pushed the current president to the point where he had to promise to end U.S. involvement. Now you hope, we all hope, that Biden holds true to that. He has thus far not. More on that in the future, I hope. Now, let's talk about Ukraine. And I thought this was really significant. So, numbers haven't changed a ton since last week. Last week I mentioned, I'll pull it up here, that nearly a quarter of Ukraine's population had been displaced, and about 3.2 had been registered abroad as such. Since then, my most recent figure has it at 3.7 million refugees registered abroad. Far more displaced internally, right? Like it was up to 10 million in total if you included internally displaced, or I think it was maybe 10 million displaced internally. Regardless, I want to focus on the refugee crisis and how it's impacting the world. 9.1% of Ukraine's pre-invasion population of around 41 million make up that 3.7 million that's now left Ukraine. That's insane. That's crazy. It makes it the sixth largest refugee crisis since like the Cold War, World War era. And I thought it would be important to bring to light the scope of what we're talking about here. Now, what we've talked about in Yemen, for example, right? There's a blockade, and that's partially why it's such a humanitarian crisis. So there's not a giant refugee crisis linked to it as far as numbers go. We want to talk about refugee crises. The top of the marker here, the biggest one created in the last 50, 60, whatever years, comes from Syria, right? The conflict that started in 2011 until now displaced 6.87 million and some, right? That's a round figure. 35.1% of Syria's population has had to flee Syria since 2011 because of, I mean, again, that's some U.S. involvement too. But I mean, Russia and what they just did in Aleppo, not just, but what they did in Aleppo was a terrible war crime as well. Anyway. Number 2 on this list would be the Afghanistan Civil War. And this is not the one where the US is involved. This is after the Russian Civil War and in sort of the build-up to the Taliban taking power from 1989 to 1996. And that saw 6.3 million Afghanis, 51.8% of Afghanistan leave. Huge refugee crisis. Next on the list was actually speaking of Russia, right, the Afghan-Soviet War from 79 to 89, in which 5.6 million people fled Afghanistan, 47.9% of Afghanistan's population. So it's remarkable to think that from 79 to 89, almost 50% of Afghanistan fled, and then it repopulated to some extent, but by 1996, another 51% had fled. Mathematically, that's like 99% of the country that's already fled, which is impossible, right? It means that they've managed to repopulate to such an extent that it's just generations of cruelty and torture for poor Afghanistan. That's a place that needs more attention too. Someday I'll do that perhaps. But next on the list, surprisingly, is Venezuela in what they call economic and political turmoil, which is like 99% sanctions in place on Venezuela by the US / NATO / whoever wants to tag on. So we've created a humanitarian crisis there. 5.08 million, again, rough figures, it's more, or roughly 15.1% of Venezuela's population has fled since 2014 because of that. And then next up, the Taliban regime. After the Taliban took power in 1989, 3.84 million people, 18.3% of, we're past 100% now for Afghanistan. So repopulation has enabled more and more cruelty for these people, if anything. Like they should have almost, terrible. So there's your top 5. But so number 6 is Russia, invading Ukraine. Now, again, 3.725, et cetera, right? 9.1% of Ukraine having fled makes it already the 6th largest refugee crisis in this time span. Next up on the list, for anyone who's curious, is the Taliban insurgency, right? So the US created issue. Somehow 10.7% of Afghanistan has fled from that. I don't know how there's anyone left in Afghanistan at this point, given all the terror that's been perpetrated on these people from the likes of Russia, the Soviets rather, the United States, with Taliban. Just absolutely devastating when you look at those figures. But so what's interesting and what's unprecedented is that for this Russian invasion of Ukraine to already be number 6 on that list of just terrible crises that we were all aware of in the last 50 or so years, this Russian invasion is already number 6. And it's important to note that this is like barely a month old as a conflict. The most recent one beyond this is what's happened in Venezuela, which has been ongoing since 2014. Again, 7-8 years old, kind of like what's going on in Yemen. So for this many people to be displaced this quickly at this rate is just mind-boggling. So, again, my heart goes out to people of Ukraine. And I think, I hope I've illustrated here that like we can make time for many conflicts around the world, and that we can have our hearts and prayers, thoughts and prayers. That's not very effective, but certainly we can keep many people in our bandwidth. And so for the people of Yemen, people of Ukraine, I hope for a better future as soon as possible. Now, let's keep going in the news really quickly. While we're on the topic of Russia, some really fascinating stuff. Boris Nemtsov, he was the deputy prime minister under Boris Yeltsin. He was potentially going to be Yeltsin's successor. Supposedly he was the preferred one. Somehow Putin gets selected instead. Days before an anti-war protest against Putin's war, it must have been in the war against the Chechens. And like, speaking of war crimes, what happened in Grozny is notoriously just terrible. But yeah, I mean, Russia has a pretty nasty history of this kind of thing. But anyway, Boris Nemtsov, days before leading an anti-war protest, was shot on a bridge near the Kremlin, February 2015. 5 men were convicted, largely considered to be a cover-up. People knew he was a really huge critic of Putin. Not just his war in Chechnya, but also generally his policies and his sort of militarism. Logic, theory, people's speculation goes that Boris Nemtsov would have been the leader that people would have hoped for post-Soviet Union, who would have had the people of Russia at heart and wanted to sort of expand their freedoms and democracy and all of that, right? Whatever. In the end, he's assassinated. The news, just fresh out of the presses, and it was actually really fascinating. There's a whole little documentary about it, but a podcast, Bellingcat and The Insider, a publication, Russian language, it looks like. They released a really fascinating sort of mini documentary revealing that, in fact, Nemtsov was being trailed by a government agent linked to the same secret assassination squad that was linked to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny more recently. And in fact, they'd been trailing him, at least as they had found out on 13 different trips as recently, pick my pen, but as recently as 10 days prior to his assassination, they had been following him. So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's fairly clear now, right? The Russian government had promised, Putin had guaranteed there was no link between them and Boris Nemtsov. There was no funny business at all. They had no interest in him. So this alone, although it hasn't been directly linked to the assassination itself, sort of undercuts any attempt to suggest that Russia wasn't tracking him or following him or involved with his existence. And of course, for him to be murdered in the way that he was, I think we can all put two and two together. But so anyway, perhaps we can all imagine a world where Putin didn't win that battle to become Boris Yeltsin's successor, and maybe a better world would be here for at least the people of Russia and certainly Ukraine. Maybe, I mean, who knows? It's all fan fiction at this point. So, moving on finally, Africa. And last week, excuse me, I mentioned some internal rules regarding where they were going to be refining their minerals and stuff. No follow-up on that, sadly. What I do have is fairly interesting. And I'm interested in these blocks. I think ultimately, like the what is outdated, what died with the whole Soviet Union versus US Cold War thing was this notion that we had these two superpowers that could like expand via actual landmass, grabbing places through old school imperialism, or even neo-imperialistically to create these like giant like Soviet blocks, things like that, which I guess was also landmass. But even beyond how they had sort of satellite states like Poland and the like, Romania. But so, and having potential opposition assassinated like the US did in Chile and all over the world, Honduras, whatever. It seems like what could rival that, in this, right today, like on the one hand you have like the US and China and another sort of duality, a dual superpower conflict on the horizon. In this Ukraine crisis, we've seen the EU rise to some prominence, and not necessarily in opposition to the United States, but as a counter in some ways, with its own interests, its own stakes in a conflict and all that. And it leads one to imagine a world where there's not just two entities fighting for everything, and in fact, via regions creating ties strong enough, economically, geopolitically, etc., to sort of look out for their interests, you could see a world where everyone, in a sort of democratic sense, can plot out what they actually want for themselves. Now, obviously, that's incredibly idealistic, and the EU represents just Europe, which was doing okay for the most part, right? Without that. This would be much better if we saw like the African Union come together, or something in South America where countries get together and can kind of unify under some regional bloc to sort of defend their interests against these sort of superpowers and by the likes of United States or China or whatever, Russia, although I don't know about that. And in light of that, so going back to Congo, they have recently joined the EAC, which is the East African Conglomerate of Nations bloc, East African Trading Bloc, and they joined Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And of course, Congo would become, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, would become the largest and most populous nation to join this group, individually, sort of single-handedly boosting the bloc's GDP from 193 to 240 billion dollars. So it's huge, and again, in line with one hoping for these types of blocs to counter the old way of like Soviet U.S. Cold War, right? Like two superpowers duking it out, and everyone else just cowering in fear, hoping they're not next in line. Again, that there's more of a democratic future where countries have a voice geopolitically, beyond placating a superpower. So this is good news, I think. And what's important is it could potentially help stabilize Congo. M23 is this rebel group, so there's now a kind of another potential civil conflict. M23 is actually mounting a sort of fairly significant campaign of violence against the people of Congo to claim power. And they're operating in the east of Congo, near the border with Uganda and Rwanda. Worryingly, 2 Rwandan soldiers were captured in recent events, suggesting that perhaps Rwanda not only has a stake in this, but is potentially helping the rebels. Maybe they want to do a Russia, right? They help a rebel group control a region, and then that region becomes aligned with the interests of Rwanda, or even territory of Rwanda, or whatever it would be. So, I mean, that's conspiratorial. Hopefully that's not what it is. And again, right, this East African trade bloc could prevent that type of thing exactly, and in fact could end up having Uganda and Rwanda help diffuse the situation and end this conflict significantly. And this is a bit of a news story. A UN helicopter was shot down in Congo by these M23 rebels. MONUSCO UN peacekeeping mission. 8 people were on board, 6 of them UN peacekeepers. I don't know if that means they're actually soldiers, or that sounds sort of like a troublesome euphemism, but whatever it is, it's bad news, no doubt. But again, right, this trade bloc could suggest a turning of the tides and a positive step, ideally. Interestingly, I found this great. In joining this trade bloc, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni said that the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, is part of the region. It is colonialism that brought problems. Now that Africa got its freedom, we should get out of the distortion. And wording aside, I think it's promising to imagine a world in which Africa is both recognizing the horrors of colonialism, dealing with those long-term, and forming trade blocs and ties regionally that can bring them into the future with more of a position to defend itself against, at least neo-colonialism. China and the United States making moves. Right, we got our eye on Equatorial Guinea. That could be a potential spot of conflict between China and the US eventually. But anyway, that's where we're going to leave this thing off. Some positive news out of the DRC, out of Congo. Some positive developments regarding trade partnerships and the like. And some good news all around to wrap things up on what is very much a dire episode for the most part. We look at Yemen and Ukraine and Russia and all of that. But so I'm going to forego a weird of the week or anything lighthearted, because I think we got to be serious for this one. And I've run on way too long. So as always, follow us on Twitter at Late Stage Trip. Follow myself at Sir_Writes_a lot. We'll be back next week, as always. And I hope once again to bring better news next time around. Peace out, everyone.